So the answer to most of the questions we ask in ecology depends on the scale at which we ask them. If you think about the structure of reef fish communities, for example, Peter Sale showed quite convincingly in the 1970s that the structure of the fish communities you find at a small scale, like an individual site or a coral bommy, depends very much on matters of chance, on stochasticity. It depends on what was recruited to the system and the sort of probabilistic mortality that occurs quite quickly in these sorts of systems. But it became quite clear that if we scale out very quickly to, say, the scale of an individual reef, or maybe even to the scale of a continental shelf, then the reef fish we find there are more predictable. They're dependent on deterministic and primarily environmental factors. And there are scales to either end of this. Ecology is full of scales. And processes at each of these scales will determine the answer to any sort of question we ask. And so ecologists, if asked theoretically about this, would like to include in any of their sort of analyses as much scale as possible. They'd like their data to be as broad as possible in scale and as high as possible in resolution, because that's the way that you encompass all of these different attributes, all these different processes. But of course, speaking practically, we tend to have to focus. First, because the resources available to anyone who's gathering data are limited. They're limited in time and they're limited in money. But also because the methods we have for understanding these systems, the mental models, the mathematical models we have are also quite limited. Ecosystems are vast and they're very, very complicated. And they're intricately interconnected. And the methods we have for understanding such things are always quite limited. Now, conservation planning and conservation management descended in large part from spatial ecology. And so it contains an interest in scales that is quite similar. The bigger the better. And this is just a sampling of the myriad papers every year that talk about conservation planning and propose conservation prioritizations and even sometimes protected area networks at enormous scales, at continental scales or at oceanic scales, or even, when possible, at global scales. That's why, for example, when we're in conservation, we tend to talk about, say, transboundary parks, parks that sort of transcend the scales of individual countries. It's why we're interested in ecosystem-based management, not just the management of single species or single locations. It's why we talk about marine protected area networks, not just marine protected areas. And it's why we're interested in governance, in sort of planning that's like co-management, that crosses governmental scales. Now, one of the driving scales in reef fish management is larval dispersal. It couples the demographics of populations at large distances, and it's very important also for the demographics at even very small scales. And there's a bunch of questions that we answer in conservation management which depend on this scale of larval dispersal. And I want to talk about three different problems, three different common management decisions which are made in marine systems, in coral reef systems, that depend very heavily on this distance, the distances at which larvae disperse. And in the last few years, just very recently, we started to get a better understanding of the scale of larval dispersal, both at a very high resolution and at a very large scale, thanks to advances in empirical analysis and in modeling. And so it's an appropriate time to reflect on the scales of the decisions that we commonly make in reef fish management and how they might be affected by this particular scale. So the first question is one of the more common questions that starts any conservation planning exercise. And I'm going to ask it in the context of Kimbe Bay. And it's the size of the planning units that make up our marine protected area networks, our marine reserve systems. Now, the data in this case, the larval dispersal data, comes from extensive work over the last decade done by researchers from James Cook University and from overseas, assembling an enormous data set of parentage, of the genetics of individuals across long periods in time in Kimbe Bay. And particularly for this species in the bottom corner, the orange clownfish. They go back year after year and they sample individuals for genotypes, and they look to see whether they can identify the parents of those baby fish. And if they can, then they can establish a dispersal event, the movement of an individual across a distance from a different reef, or maybe even from the same reef that juvenile was sampled from. Now, on the basis of this observational evidence, as it builds up, we can construct statistical models of larval dispersal through space that allow us to extrapolate those data to every reef in the system. In the case of Kimbe Bay, all 900 of the different reefs that are spread across this marine management zone. And you can see, for example, here that this is the larval dispersal that's based around Kimbe Island, down here at the centre. And you can see that the larval dispersal is probably spreading larvae across large distances, and that really agrees with the data that has parameterised this model. And this larval dispersal scale will affect the ability of the marine reserve system in Kimbe Bay to achieve some of the aims that it purports to solve. And so Gary Russ made the point earlier that one of the real objectives of a marine protected area is that it is in some sense self-sustaining, and that in a demographic sense it's closed. It can be depended on to persist maybe in the absence or in the degradation of the surrounding area. And so there are two key scales in Kimbe Bay, and the first is the scale of the entire management zone. And we would like to, if possible, choose the size of that management zone in a way that encompasses as much of the dispersal in the system, as much of the demographics as possible. And so you can see here the outline in green of the total boundary of the marine park in Kimbe. And based on the larval dispersal kernels to be fit, we can say that even though there are fringing reefs, and you can see them in blue, around and outside of the marine park area, nevertheless, in a given year, 95% of the recruits that we observe settling in Kimbe Bay have come from populations on reefs in Kimbe Bay. And so despite the existence of populations external to the marine park, it can be considered relatively closed. Now at a much smaller scale, at the scale of the individual areas of interest in Kimbe, which let's consider them protected areas, we would also like to see a good degree of self-reliance. And so this figure here is an inversion of the larval dispersal kernel. It's asking where the adults that fed the populations, in this case in the Wulai Island Reserve, which is in the south coast of the bay, where those adults came from. And the purple polygon is the outline of the reserve, and it shows that about 50% of the dispersers that settle in Wulai in a given year will have come from other adults within that reserve. It's not quite self-recruitment because the reserve contains a large number of reefs, but you can consider it to be, say, internal recruitment or self-reliance. Now, the actual source of all the adults that make up the next generation of Wulai Island can be seen to be much larger. The red polygon is the extent of 99% of the adults that are put into the population of Wulai in a given year. But the reserve itself is relatively self-sufficient and would seem to be therefore a reasonable scale at which to plan. And there are 11 different reserves in the bay that contain sizable fringing reefs that would have orange clownfish on them. And if we plot the scale of those reefs in square kilometres, the scale of those reserves in square kilometres on the x-axis, and the degree of internal recruitment on the y-axis, we see the quantitative relationship between the scale of management decisions and the performance of those management decisions on the y-axis. In this case, the measure of internal recruitment. And we see diminishing returns as scales get larger, the performance of the system from the perspective of that objective of marine protected areas, the self-reliance, becomes greater. Now, the second example I want to talk about, the second question, is also being asked in the Bismarck Sea near Kimbe Bay, but it's on Manus Island, just to the north. And Manus Island contains the square-tailed coral groper, and the south coast of the island is home to 5 communities of fishing people, of Titan people. And you can see the colours of the reefs here indicate, where's my mouse? The customary tenure areas of 5 different communities. And these communities rely on the population of square-tailed coral groper, amongst many other species. And they rely on it for both personal use and also for occasional export and trade. And through the work of JC researchers, many of the same researchers in the Kimbe Bay project, but also the Nature Conservancy and Rick Hamilton, a large parentage data set of dispersal events is also being constructed for this species in this area. And fitting larval dispersal kernels to this observational data gives us the dispersal kernel you see in the bottom, the orange line here. It's showing at the same scale as the entire island, or the same scale as the map, the distance at which larvae are going to travel before they settle. And the first thing you notice is that it's a very different scale to the management areas. There's what we consider to be like a misalignment or a lack of fit between the scale of the management, the customary tenure areas, and the scale of the dispersal. And that means that it's going to be relatively difficult to manage this system effectively with this misalignment. That's the sort of the current conservation theories about scale. Basically, the idea is that if you act in a responsible way towards the population on your reefs, then the benefits of that responsible, sustainable action are going to be exported through larval dispersal to your neighbours. And conversely, if you act irresponsibly and you overharvest your system, then the costs of that overharvesting are going to be shared by other elements of the community. And so faced with this lack of fit between the management scales and the ecological scales, The solution that conservation theorists propose is coordinated management. Is that these groups get together and they agree amongst themselves on a management scheme that encompasses the whole stock. So we're trying to encourage the management scale to align itself with the largest possible conservation scale. And so we constructed a locally parameterized bioeconomic model of this fishery that took into account the fact that there are independent actors who can make independent decisions. And we wanted to assess whether it was true, and to what extent it was true, that coordinated management would deliver better outcomes. In this case, a higher long-term sustainable yield for this fishery. And so we worked out the sustainable yield that would occur if all of the groups acted independently. So they decided on their own management of their own subsection of the community and applied it, and that's at the far left there. That's when there's one group in each of these sort of coalitions, so it's independent action. And we also worked out if you started to encourage more and more cooperation between these groups, and if you increase the scale of the management as we go from left to right, you get all the way to the end and you get what's called a grand coalition. Everyone's involved in the management, and the scales of the ecosystem and the scales of the management system have been aligned, and in fact, you get the best outcomes that you could expect. Now, the third example, the third management question concerns the Great Barrier Reef. You can see it here in its full extent from the Torres Strait on the left all the way down to Fraser Island on the right. And in this case, it's probably too big a scale to talk about parentage data, and so we estimate the larval dispersal in the system using a biophysical model of larval dispersal where individual larvae are released into a modeled oceanographic environment, and they spend time in that environment developing sensory and locomotive capabilities, and eventually after their pelagic larval duration has given them a degree of competency, they attempt to settle. And this model was constructed by Lou Mason, who's currently at the University of Tasmania, and it allows us to estimate within this system the amount of dispersal between all of the reefs. And we're thinking about the line fishery that concerns the coral trout, the leopard groper, and Morgan Pratchett gave a great talk about this last night. It's the more valuable species on the reef, and it's at the moment managed by a relatively coarse scale management system. A single total allowable catch, if we put aside for now the green zones and no-take areas, the primary management of this species is through a single management resolution, just one catch. Now, because this is not supposed to be a prescriptive model of GBR management, it's just supposed to be indicative and to investigate the roles of scale, instead of using a total allowable catch, we've managed it using a single license price. But the two are basically mathematically equivalent. Now, in this case, the system, the variability of the ecological system is obviously much more complex than that of the GBR. And so instead of talking about scale as I have in the previous two examples where better and better scales means bigger and bigger scales, we're going to keep the scale fixed at the marine park area and think about the resolution of management, the bottom end of that scale. And so we know that not only does the population of the reef fish vary at a scale which is much more finely resolved than our management abilities, we also know that the economic scale, that the behavior of the fishing fleets is varying on a reef by reef basis, and probably even at a sub-reef scale. And so managing a system which is very heterogeneous with a very coarse scale management system gives us, again, this misalignment that we don't want. And the appropriate way to solve that would be to impose a more complex management system. And so you can think of all different ways you could have not just a single license price across the entire GBR, you could have multiple license prices. And you could use those license prices to control the system at a finer resolution. Now, the first case here, the single management case, is very common in fisheries. It's very common to have stocks which are internally heterogeneous being managed by a system which is very homogeneous. But there are many reasons we might want to be more sophisticated. We might want to break up the system into two big regions, each with a different license. There might be a license for the northern region and a license for the southern region. And this is where the larval dispersal comes in this case. Because as John Pandolfi pointed out yesterday, a lot of the flows in the GBR are from the north to the south. And that means that in many ways, the northern region of the GBR, at both large and small scales, is a source for the southern region. And in this case, if you let fishermen act in a sort of profit maximizing way, they'll tend to harvest the source reefs and not target the sink reefs. But if you want to maximize your long-term sustainable yield, you would want to try and reduce the harvesting in the source section and encourage it in the southern section. And so you would use your two license prices then to lower the license price in the southern section and to encourage harvesting, and to increase it in the northern section in an attempt to dissuade this sort of open access catastrophe. But you might want to also model a system, you might want to also manage a system at higher and higher resolutions. And so we modeled an increasingly resolved management scheme where instead of just being one license price, there was two, there were four that corresponds to the GBR management areas. There could be six that correspond to Bruce Mapston in ELFSIM's description of the commercial zones of the fishery. There could be one for each of the 30 bioregions that we used to rezone the reef in 2004. Or at the very end of this extreme, you could construct a different license price for every one of the reefs in the system. This is known as like a first best economic solution. So for each of these scenarios, we modeled a system where the regulator, in an attempt to maximize their revenue, is choosing license prices. And once they choose those license prices, the fishing fleets purchase the licenses, which allow them to spend time on the reefs in the area where that license belongs to. And they go out there and with their understanding of the reef and their understanding of the different populations of fish on the reef, they distribute their effort in a way that maximizes their profits. And then at the third scale, you have these populations of reef fish, which are being driven by both the variability in the environmental system, by their larval dispersal, and also by the excess mortality caused by the fishing fleet. So the dynamics of the fishery and of the population in this case are both endogenous to the model. The only levers available to the regulator in an attempt to maximize their revenue is the license prices. And so if we plot the regulator revenue on the y-axis, and we say, well, what could be achieved by an increasingly highly resolved license regime? We see that the more resolved the license becomes, the better our outcomes become. That once again, as in ecology, as in all of these conservation examples, a bigger scale is better. And this is not quite a linear scale. The 2000 point would have to be several meters to the right if it was linear. And so you can see once again this sort of diminishing returns curve that comes from being ever more inclusive of scale. And so looking across all of these three examples, we see this really consistent pattern, and it agrees quite strongly with our expectations about this. That as we become more and more inclusive of scale in our problems, as we either treat them at a larger scale or at a higher resolution, we get better outcomes. As we include more scales and the scales become more and more distant from the central question that we're asking from a management perspective, the improvement we get is diminishing, is decelerating. But nevertheless, it increases. And this is not something that's going to surprise the body of conservation theory, and there are other examples of this sort of behaviour happening. But that's kind of part of the problem, because at the moment, the sort of dominant discourse about scale in conservation planning is that bigger is always better. And it's an idea that focuses primarily on this half of the problem, which is the benefits that can accrue if we manage the system at a more finely resolved scale, at a bigger scale if we think globally. And there's another half of this problem that we don't know so much about and we don't model very well, and that's the costs that are associated with operating at different scales. And if you think of the Kimbe Bay example, if you increase the size of marine protected areas, you might get a more self-reliant system, but you start to incur costs on other users in the system, opportunity costs. If you think about the Manus Island example, you can certainly encourage different groups to get together and to work out a sustainable management program that includes all of their shared fisheries. But the more people you get in the room and the more people who are needed whenever a decision is made, the higher the transaction costs that will be associated with any decision. And finally, if you think about the Great Barrier Reef, then sure, we could think about a total allowable catch that was operating on a sub-reef scale if we really had the ability to do that. But there's uncertainties, and there are enforcement costs, and there are compliance costs, which are all going to increase as our sophisticated regime becomes more and more sophisticated. And as the scales increase and as the resolutions of our management increases, the benefits that we start to accrue diminish, they decelerate. But the costs that are associated with achieving those ever-diminishing returns are almost certain to accelerate. And so we don't spend a lot of time, and we've spent a lot of time really aggressively pursuing and describing the quantitative benefits of operating at a larger scale, and both implicitly and explicitly asking that management be done at larger and more inclusive scales. But we really haven't spent all that much time either thinking or discussing the counterbalancing costs that come with thinking at those scales. And so I guess the next step, and what would be really the next challenge for thinking about scale in conservation in a really practical way, would be to get a better handle, a really flexible and a robust handle on even the shape of how conservation costs change as the scale of the actions start to increase. And so I guess, given that the skills of most conservationists, certainly the ones who come from ecological backgrounds, aren't really in this sort of analysis, steps forward in the future are going to include, I think, a really integrative and a really humble collaboration with social scientists and with economists. And I think that's a really good thing. Thanks. Oh, yeah. So clap.